We're Group 18, and we did our presentation on the Hungarian Revolution of 1956.
To start off, I want to talk about the history of Hungary before the revolution. During World War II, Hungary was allied with the Axis powers of Germany, Bulgaria, Italy, and Romania. In 1944, Hungary was invaded by the Soviet Union. Even with help from Nazi Germany, they were not able to beat the Soviets. Then, in 1945, Hungarians were under control of Moscow, Russia, and a guy named Mátyás Rasuki, who was the Hungarian communist leader from 1949 to 1956, was put in power by Stalin. When Stalin died in 1953, a lot of people from Eastern Europe were very hopeful that Hungary could be able to escape the rule from Soviets. Under the leadership of Rasuki, in 1950 to 1952, he had implemented a security police which forcibly relocated thousands of people to help obtain the property and housing for the Working People's Party. The education system under Rasuki made Russian language and communist political instruction mandatory subjects that had to be taught in schools across the nation. The nation's income rose during the first part of the 1950s, but the standards of living dropped dramatically. They ran into many shortages of essential needs like meat, flour, and sugar. The government also started to issue a lot more bonds, which only increased the inflation of Hungary. During 1956, Hungary had a population of about 9.8 million people.
For those of you that don't know where it is, the map on the left displays Hungary, which is located in Eastern Europe. The map on the right displays the Eastern Bloc, which is made up of the satellite countries created by the communists, which included those in the Warsaw Pact. This is also known as the Iron Curtain. During the time of the Hungarian Revolution, there were two main communist leaders that had an impact on the entirety of it. The first of the two leaders was Joseph Stalin. Stalin was a leader for the Soviet Union from 1929 up until 1953. Stalin was born in present-day Georgia in 1878. As a teenager, Stalin was granted a scholarship to attend seminary school, which was part of the Georgian Orthodox Church. During his time at the school, he grew fond of the philosopher Karl Marx and his writings of the Communist Manifesto. After a couple of years of being there, Stalin was later expelled for missing tests and exams, but claims the real reason for being expelled was promoting Marxist propaganda. After his removal from school, he found himself involved in labor strikes and demonstrations that were tied to the Marxist Social Democratic movement, led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik family. During this, he worked his way up the ranks and found himself involved in criminal activity that got himself arrested on multiple occasions. The party later took over power in 1917, and he continued to become close with Lenin, becoming his second-hand man until Lenin's death in 1924, where he would eventually take over as the leader of the party. During his time, he ruled with a totalitarian form of government and eliminated anyone that opposed him, with either sentencing them to death or sending them to the Gulag, which were labor camps where prisoners had to deal with extreme and unhealthy conditions. Stalin ruled the Soviet Union through the 1930s and World War II, where he sided with the Allies after Germany's leader Adolf Hitler broke the Nazi-Soviet pact. He continued his rule until 1953, when he died of a stroke, ending his 30-year reign. The second of the two leaders was Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader for the Soviet Union from 1953 until 1964. Khrushchev took over 6 months after the death of Stalin. Once in office, he began a de-Stalinization process that gave the people under communist rule hope for more freedoms in the future. Although these were his goals, he set out to maintain a strong grip on the Eastern Bloc and knew that there were clear limits on what the people could and could not do. During his time in power, he delivered a speech to the satellite state of Poland, which was known as the Secret Speech. In his speech, he told those in attendance of his de-Stalinization campaign and the hopes for changes, which would give the people of Poland and later Hungary the hope to make their own changes. During the time of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, two leaders appointed by the Communist Party played a significant role in how the revolution ended. The first of these two leaders, who was mentioned earlier, was Mátyás Rasuki. He was born in 1892 to Jewish parents with the last name of Rosenfeld. Before his birth, during the late 1800s, Rasuki had family members that took part in the Hungarian Revolution of 1848, and as a result was forced to flee the area with their defeat. The new village his family migrated to was against the Jewish community, and with them knowing the Rosenfeld family was supporters of the Party of Independence in 1948, they changed their last name to Rakuzi. As a youth, Rakuzi was an active supporter of social democracy and the ideas that came with it, but later returned to Hungary in 1918 and was now favoring a communist viewpoint. He served as an active member in the party and was arrested on multiple occasions, where he was sentenced first to 8 years and later life, but was later freed and allowed to return to Moscow. In 1944, when he returned for the second time to Hungary, he led communist troops into the country, which was the beginning of their station there. He ruled until the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, where he was then relieved of his position by newly elected leader Nikita Khrushchev. The second of the appointed was the more liberal of the two leaders, Emir Nagy. Nagy served multiple terms as the elected communist leader in Hungary. The first began in July of 1953 when Nikita Khrushchev took power. He commanded Hungary for less than 2 years and was removed from his position due to liberal policies he was trying to put in place. Nagy later returned to power in the fall of 1956 after students and workers in both Poland and Hungary started to protest. After the Second World War ended, the Soviet Union, who was part of the Allied forces, controlled Hungary and placed troops within to make sure that the government and operations ran smoothly. The first of the major events that took place was the signing of the Warsaw Pact that took place in May of 1955, where the Soviet Union signed a treaty along with 7 satellite states under their control that worked to balance out the powers with NATO and led to military expansion and the integration of their blocs. The second major event that took place was in June of 1956, after the speech was delivered by Nikita Khrushchev, giving the people of Poland hopes for changes. Due to the revolts, martial law was imposed, and Emir Nagy, the current Hungarian leader, was removed for the first time from office and replaced temporarily by Erno Gyro. The third major event that happened prior to the revolution was in October of that year, when the word spread south and the citizens of the communist-occupied Hungary heard of Poland's revolt and gained confidence to try to revolt themselves.
On October 23, 1956, students of Budapest Technical University gather at the statue of General Bem. The students read out a Declaration of Independence and publicize their 16-point demands in support of Poland's efforts to gain sovereignty from the Soviet Union. By 6 p.m., 200,000 students, intellectuals, and workers poured into the streets of Budapest, surrounding the Hungarian parliament. Later that night, Erno Gyro, a Hungarian Communist Party leader, broadcast a speech dismissing the demands of the Hungarian people, labeling the crowds a reactionary mob. The uncompromising communist stance led the Hungarian people to take actions into their own hands, meaning they carried out one of their 16-point demands by tearing down the statue of Stalin. As the crowds began dispersing, a large group marched towards the Radio Budapest building in order to nationally broadcast their points. However, the building was being guarded by the AVH. The AVH are the Hungarian secret police. They barricaded the building, and when the revolutionaries began trying to take the radio station by storm, the AVH opened fire on the crowd, and the first casualties of the Hungarian Revolution fell. The killing provoked a large-scale riot by the Hungarian people. The riot led to Erno Gyro launching a military intervention from the Soviet Union to suppress the uprising. The next day, on October 24th, the Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest. In hopes to stop protests, Imre Nagy is reappointed as prime minister and asks for a ceasefire. However, on October 25th, a demonstrators group outside the parliament building, demanding political changes, was shot at by Soviet tanks, escalating the fighting. As things continued to get worse, Erno Gyro was forced to resign as first secretary.
János Kadar took up first secretary and Imre Nagy took up prime minister as Gyro fled to the Soviet Union. This led the Hungarian revolutionaries to turn the morale around and lead an aggressive offensive against the oppressive Soviets and what was left of their AVH forces. This offensive was led by Béla Karali, who had just been released from prison for the crimes he committed in World War II, and in the execution of anyone who was a suspected communist, state security member, or military personnel for the Soviet Union until the 28th of October. The Hungarian communist committees could do nothing but organize defense against the rebels at this time, as they kept pushing harder and harder for an end to the Soviet regime and policies imposed upon them. The resistance fought Soviet tanks in the narrow streets of Budapest, and revolutionary councils arose nationwide. Public communist symbols such as red stars and Soviet war memorials were removed, and communist books were burned. On the 28th of October, the Soviets were finally suppressed and removed from Budapest, and a ceasefire was negotiated between the Soviets and the rebels. During this ceasefire, party reformer Nagy got straight to work and declared that the government would assess the uprising as a quote-unquote great national and democratic event. He called for the dissolution of the AVH, the establishment of a Hungarian National Guard, the immediate withdrawal of the Soviets from Budapest, and that the negotiations for the withdrawal of all Soviet forces from Hungary would begin. Hungary finally withdrew from the Warsaw Pact and declared themselves neutral. On the 3rd of November, though, a Hungarian delegation led by the Minister of Defense, Paul Meliter, was called to discuss the terms of the Soviet withdrawal, and the Russians did not take this lightly. General Ivan Serov, chief of the Soviet security police, ordered the arrest of the Hungarian delegation, and the Soviets began to take action by once again surrounding Budapest with tanks and firing at anyone, rebel or civilian, and thus breaking the ceasefire. They quite effectively split the city in half and controlled every bridge to eventually choke the rebel forces out with force and lead the Hungarian Revolution to a quite decisive failure by the 10th of November.
The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 resulted in a lot of consequences for Hungary and Eastern Europe as a whole. After the second wave of Soviet forces advanced through Hungary on November 4th, an enormous amount of Hungarians fled towards the borders of Yugoslavia and Austria. Upwards to 200,000 had fled Soviet control and managed to escape Hungary. Another consequence of the revolution was a large string of power shifts in Hungary. At the end of World War II, Hungary had Matyas Rákosi as their dictator, but riots against the regime began, so Khrushchev and the Soviets had put Erno Gero in charge. He also was unpopular, so they replaced their leader again and set Imre Nagy in power. He was more liberal and wanted to break away from the Warsaw Pact, so the Soviets, in fear of leaving a buffer zone with Western Europe, decided to invade and ended up executing him. He ruled under strict communist conditions but allowed some freedom of speech. One of the more serious consequences of the revolution was the realization that no country in Eastern Europe could leave the Warsaw Pact without resistance from the Soviet Union. When they found out that Nagy was planning on leaving the pact, they sent 6,000 tanks across the border and killed up to 30,000. This sent a message to the other countries under Soviet control that they would not be able to leave the Warsaw Pact without major casualties, and even if they tried, the possibility of failing was very high. The amount of destruction in Hungary directly warned the other countries not to break away from the Soviet sphere of influence. Internationally, the events that occurred in Hungary led to a terrible relationship between the East and the West. The West realized that although Stalin was dead, the Soviets were set on keeping all the countries they had influence over in check and would do anything they had to do it. The West also realized they had no influence in the East at all and couldn't do anything behind the Iron Curtain to help the population to people under strict communist control. This led to a bitter relationship all the way up until the end of the Cold War.